under your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 144 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Once again, I am joined by Mary, a Canadian hockey fan who thinks being shorthanded means you are down to your last Labatt's blue can. I am merely a high stick in the crease named Darren. Congrats on your hockey title, mon ami. Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great game. I unfortunately had to go to bed before the end of it though, because I get up so early, but it was awesome to see everybody celebrating the next day. And last night I said to you when we were at Eddie's, I was like, gosh, I wish I could get a Molson Canadian.
Well, tough days here in the old US of A with hockey, but oh well, what can you do? Anyway.
It was a great game.
It was. But the Olympics is coming up soon. Anyway, so Mary, today we are going to spend some time talking about a well-known yet enigmatic Confederate general, and that would be one Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. And, you know, he's interesting because he's that silver spoon-fed kid who would develop into a master strategist, yet for reasons, mostly self-inflicted, admittedly, he found himself never really attaining that true potential in the Civil War.
No, he never did. And you've always likened him to being a bullpen pitcher that never gets put in at the right time or whatever. P.G.T. Beauregard was one of the, back when I started studying the Civil War when I was a kid, he was one of the first generals I remember reading about. So he's always kind of stuck with me. But fascinating life, fascinating individual. He didn't do himself many favors with the ego that he had on him.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's a lot of it's self-inflicted, but he's a very interesting fella. You know, he was born on May 28th of 1818 in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, not far from New Orleans, Mary, to one of the more illustrious military families of Louisiana history, as they say, right? Mm-hmm. His family goes back to the 13th century when an 18-year-old Tyder the Young headed a party of Welsh in revolt to King Edward I of England, right? Wow. His revolt failed, so he fled to France, where he was welcomed by the French King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, who was probably more famously known for arresting and executing all the Knights Templar on Friday the 13th, 1307, which is why Friday the 13th is a suspicion day, a superstition, blah, blah, blah. But France was at war with England, so Philip was happy to have Tyder on his side. But anyways, Tyder returned to England and married an aide to King Philip, a woman by the name of Marguerite, a French woman, and their union would kind of help cool the tensions between England and France.
Interesting.
But years later, Tyder's descendants changed the name from Tyder to Toutant, which became the family's surname. By the end of the 16th century, the last male living member of the Toutant family died, leaving just one daughter who married a guy named Sir Pate de Beauregard. Toutant de Beauregard became the family name, eventually dropping the D and just using Toutant Beauregard. So there you go. That's kind of how the family name comes around.
Interesting.
Jacques Toutant Beauregard moved from France to Louisiana in the early 1700s. He was the commander of the French flotilla, and he had three sons, including Louis, who became an officer in the Spanish army when Spain took possession of Louisiana in 1766. Now, Louis Toutant Beauregard bought a plantation in St. Bernard Parish and became very successful. It was a sugar plantation, thanks to a large number of slaves that he accumulated. Louis' son Jacques would eventually take over the family business and would marry a woman named Helene Judith de Reggio, a member of the Medina family, another elite family with ties to the American Revolution, although no ties known to Funky Cole Medina. Different family, Mary. Okay, just saying. Now, Jacques and Helene had 5 children. Their third son was born in 1818, who they would name Pierre Gustave, who was then raised on the Toutant Nord sugar plantation, which is now later going to be called Contreras after Pierre's later military success in Mexico, right? Now, here's the thing, though. St. Bernard, which is now part of the American Louisiana then, was significantly Creole in both language and culture. And young Pierre grew up in a life of privilege on a rich plantation to an elite slave-owning family, right? Now, Pierre grew up with slaves his age, as well as relatives that were, quote, Creole of color, they said. There you go with that, through marriage. And, his closest friend as a child was a slave named Baptiste, who, according to Pierre, was the best storyteller he ever knew. He was also close to a slave woman and family nurse named Francois Simeon, who Pierre remained close with even after the Civil War. And Francois used to refer to Pierre as her son. That's how close they were, right? But when Pierre turned 8 years old, he was sent to an elite primary run school by a Mr. V. Dubuchel, who only taught the best sons of the best Louisiana families. And again, Beauregard is Spalding Smells here. I mean, he's a silver spoon fed. He is, but he's a popular student, but he got high marks. But he was very decisive to the point of stubbornness.
Yeah, and one interesting thing to note about when he went to school is that until that time, he had only spoken French.
Right.
And this was his first time speaking English. And there are some stories that I read about him, and including in the biography that T. Harry Williams wrote about him back in, I think it was the 50s or 60s, that Beauregard always retained a slight French accent because of that, because of speaking French.
We.
We.
But again, the thing at that age, though, the thing about him was that he had a real passion for all things military.
He was obsessed with Napoleon. Napoleon was Beauregard's hero, and that's who he would try to model himself after. And the reason for that is the school was run by two men who had served under Napoleon, and they would talk about their service with him. And this is what began Beauregard's fascination with Napoleon. And in his spare time, he would often study Napoleon, about his battles and all that. And so this is his hero, is Napoleon.
Yeah, I mean, he would get excited when he saw a passing soldier or even heard the beat of drums, to the point where he would forget to eat, ignore all of his studies. It was like a kid playing a video game nowadays. Just that's how he was. The thing about Pierre, though, at a young age, is he had a wicked temper, kind of like you, right?
What?
When he was 9 years old, and this is a fun story with him, he found himself at his aunt's house, not far from the estate where he lived. And like many of us, Pierre had one of those uncles who was loud, obnoxious. He liked to torment the kids to get a laugh out of the adults. God knows I had an uncle like that, and most people did, right? His uncle teased Pierre in front of the family, who got so angry. What does Pierre do? He goes outside, he gets a stick, comes back inside, and proceeds to beat the hell out of the uncle in front of the whole family.
Oh, my God.
Now, the uncle, he runs for his life. He hides outside in the outhouse, where the 9-year-old Pierre guarded the door with the stick in his hand, promising to hit him again unless he comes out and apologizes for embarrassing him.
Wow.
So that must have gone pretty fun, the old house there. But Pierre's parents raised him Catholic. Mm-hmm. And when he was 10 years old, they took him to church to make his first communion. A lot of people do that. They still do. Pierre, with both of his parents and his spiritual guide, which is probably like a Sunday school teacher, they all showed up at the old St. Louis Cathedral, for the ceremony. You can imagine they're all dressed up and, that whole thing. When the time came for Pierre to walk down, to walk to the altar and receive his first communion, he rose, he slowly began to walk up to the altar, and just before he got there, what does he do? He stops, he freezes, he turns, and runs out of the church full speed to the horror of his parents, okay? I mean, so he didn't ultimately make his first communion for 2 full years after that, but he just freaked out and ran.
I wonder if he was like, I don't know, he doesn't seem like, just studying him doesn't seem like the type of person that would have like stage fright.
Who knows? But, and this is, you kind of alluded to this a second ago, by age 11, Pierre's going to move to New York City, where he'll spend the next 4 years under the guidance of a man named Mr. Pognet. I can't do these French names.
I can't either.
Pognet, a retired officer in the French army, where, again, he began that informal military training, something that he wanted to do, but his parents did not want Pierre anything to do with the military. In New York, he first learned to speak English, and he soon spoke it fluently. It was why in New York City is where he discovered all hate for things Yankees, I assume. Every aspect of the Yankees, I'm sure he did, right? But from that point on, every letter Pierre wrote was in English and not in French. But to your point, he always maintained that French accent.
Yeah.
So age 16, what happens, Mary? He gets an appointment to where?
To West Point.
There you go.
And it was actually, his family initially objected to it. And his father was especially against it. But Beauregard, when he wanted something, he could be very stubborn about it, but he would keep at it. Like, he was like, no, this is what I want to do.
So I know someone like that.
Whatever. So anyway, he eventually got the appointment to West Point. And he's going to start there in 1834. And this is where he begins to Americanize himself more here. So he ends up dropping the hyphen from his name. And he eventually is going to go by just G.T. Beauregard and drop Pierre. He felt Pierre just was not American enough for him. And he, 16 years old, he is trying to fit in at West Point. For a while, he went by Peter, but that didn't work. So he would always sign his name's G.T. Beauregard. So he's going by Gustav, which doesn't exactly sound like an American name either, but whatever works for him.
Sure,
right?
I think Mary Margaret. I can't imagine why anybody would do such a thing and drop a name.
Well, he was there. He's described as being very grave and drawn, withdrawn, and that's how he was as a child. So it sounds almost like I said earlier, he doesn't seem like in his later years he doesn't seem like he would have been the type of person to be an introvert, but that's how he was. But he does excel at sports. He's an excellent horseback rider, just like Ulysses S. Grant was. And he had very high grades as well.
He was a great student, like you said, class of that famous 1838 class, finishing second of 45 in a class that included future combatant Irvin McDowell, as well as a Confederate peer, one William Hardee, Mary, right? Upon graduation, he's going to finish second. Like I said, he'll be appointed second lieutenant of the United States Engineers, which is one of those plum jobs you get when you graduate West Point, all the smart kids.
Did you come across the story in your research where he allegedly was dating General Winfield Scott's daughter?
Well, that's what they are. That's probably why you got dropped as Gustav. Anyway, whatever it was. But he does use those engineering skills in the Mexican War when he drew up the plans in 1847 to direct the construction of fortifications in the city of Tampico. And in March of that year, Beauregard is going to join Major General Winfield Scott, probably talked about his daughter, on the expedition against Mexico City, where he distinguished himself as a strategist and an engineer at the Battle of Cerro Gordo and at the Siege of Veracruz. Now, again, this is where this is where he hung his hat. He was a fantastic engineer, great strategist, right? His star really took off when he advocated an attack on the western approaches to Mexico City when most of the generals said, no, that's a bad idea. Yeah. The attack ultimately happened, and it was a huge success, and Beauregard was brevetted the title of captain at this point. Now, General Joseph Totten, the chief of U.S. Engineers, a New Haven, Connecticut resident, and was the cousin of Joseph Mansfield, who was killed at Antietam later on, he says of Beauregard, now Totten's his direct boss, this is a quote, "It affords the department high satisfaction to communicate to you the well-earned reward of your efforts on the fields in Mexico." Now, when the Mexican War ended, it seemed that Beauregard's military itch was kind of scratched. So what does he do? He gives it the old quit anyway.
Yep.
He decides he's going to quit the army and return to New Orleans, which again stunned many in the army at the time. And again, Beauregard was a young, rising star.
Yep.
And the army didn't want to lose him.
Well, he was also a little disgruntled too because Robert E. Lee, captain at the time, Mexican War, he was disappointed when Lee and other officers received more brevets than he did. And Beauregard had been one of the first officers in Mexico City. So I think he might have had a little bit of bitterness.
Well, that's going to come a lot now. Winfield Scott personally wrote to Beauregard asking him to reconsider. And the commanding general, he wrote again, a quote, "My dear sir, I am much concerned to learn that you think of leaving the army after acquiring at such an early age so much distinction in it." General Percifer F. Smith, Beauregard's one of his superiors in Mexico, he also wrote, "My dear Beauregard, I look upon you quitting our service as the greatest calamity that can befall the army and our country." Now, whether it was these letters or what, Beauregard ultimately changed his mind and stayed with the army. But here's the thing. He clearly knew that his value to it, and perhaps maybe was giving him a little bit of an entitlement because of his early success. Yeah. I mean, think about it. You're your job over there at the DQ, and you're doing well, and you get a lot of. You're gonna give it the old quit, and suddenly no, you got to stay. You're so good. It's going to go to your head a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's definitely what happens to him. He's definitely and he's very, like Beauregard, the one thing about him is he's very set in his ways. Like I read one story that happened during the Mexican War where he wanted to do what was a textbook maneuver. because he'd read it somewhere. He'd learned it at West Point. And he did have trouble disengaging from the textbook when someone wanted to do something different. He was like, but that's not written down anywhere, kind of thing. Like, so he was a little bit stubborn in that way. But yeah, definitely, I think this is where his ego.
No, it definitely was. Yeah. But from 18, don't forget, he's a rich kid too.
Yeah.
He's not used to being told no. From 1853 to 1860, he's going to serve as the commander of the Mississippi and Lake defenses of Louisiana. But when that secession crisis started to brew, it was clear Beauregard's focus clearly shifted. He was never focused on politics nor slavery. I mean, he grew up in the environment, but he was a loud proponent of states' rights, and he felt his priority was always to Louisiana, more than anything, right? So November 20th, 1860, this is the height of the secession fever. Beauregard is going to learn that he's been appointed superintendent at West Point. And on his way from New Orleans to New York City, he will stop in Washington to visit his old boss, that General Totten we talked about from Mexico. And he walks into his office and he tells Totten, listen, if Louisiana secedes, I'm going with Louisiana.
Yeah.
Now, Totten's going to try to change his mind. Beauregard was very resolute about this. It was funny because when he walked in, just by happenstance, what does Totten have opened up on his desk is a full map of Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie.
Wow.
And just by happenstance, he was studying the defenses against a potential attack. He then goes up to New York to meet with Generals Gustavus Smith and Mansfield Lovell, who all fought together in Mexico. Now, this is kind of like, this is similar to the meeting that Louis Armstead had with old Winnie Boy in Los Angeles.
Yep.
They're all sitting around, teary-eyed. But they were trying to decide what are they going to do. Now, the ironic thing about them is all three were Southerners. So both Smith and Lovell would ultimately stay with their home states as well by the Confederacy. But it was kind of a similar type meeting.
Yeah.
Sitting around having cigars, probably talking about Scott's daughter. Who knows, right?
Talking about Scott's daughter.
But soon after arriving in West Point for his new job, he's told, hey, that job offer, yeah, we're going to take that away from you.
And that was after Louisiana had seceded. And then he did protest it to the War Department that they had cast improper reflection upon him by forcing him out as a Southern officer before any hostilities had even begun.
Yeah, he's like, well, okay. So he lost his job. It's like the movie Friday. How do you get fired on your day off?
It's like, I haven't even started yet.
No. So he's going to take a trip back to New Orleans, and then he was informed by telegraph by Governor Thomas More, to your point, that Louisiana had voted to become the sixth state to secede from the Union, and the state's militia was going to be placed under the command of guess who? Braxton Bragg.
Oh.
Old Jelly Bones, right?
Jelly Bones.
Now, Beauregard was requested to come back as soon as possible by Governor Moore. And when he lands in New Orleans by steamer, who's docked in the harbor? The Star of the West is there.
Yeah.
And just ironically, that's where it was. Now, Beauregard's going to meet with Governor Moore, and he was ordered to complete the defenses of New Orleans. Mm-hmm. Something, again, he was an expert at. But he actually turned down the offer. He told him that he hadn't resigned from the United States Army Commission yet, and he needed to do that first.
Yeah.
He was then approached by Bragg, who offered him a position as colonel of engineers and artillery. And again, for the same reasons, Beauregard nopes it.
Yep.
He's not going to do it. Instead, he kind of acted more as an advisor, and he instructed Governor Moore to arm Fort Jackson and Fort Phillip with more guns instead of those smaller inland forts like Fort Macomb and Fort Pike, right? On February 22nd, 1861, I think that's the anniversary of today, Beauregard got a letter from Leroy Walker. He's the first Confederate Secretary of War, and he asked him to travel to Montgomery to meet with their new president, a guy named Jefferson Davis. It was going to be a 2-week trip, he said. But the ironic thing is this trip is going to last 4 years, ultimately, right? 4 days later, Beauregard will arrive in Montgomery, and he's going to meet with Davis. And he showed him a map of Charleston and said, hey, as an engineer, what would you do if you were in charge of defending this city? So Beauregard, he tells me here's exactly what I would do, blah, blah, blah. Davis goes, that sounds great. I want to make you a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, and I want you to take direct action against the Federals that held Fort Sumter and Moultrie. Beauregard's like, well, that sounds cool, but until my resignation from the U.S. Army is accepted, I cannot take this job. Why? He felt accepting a position beforehand would make him a traitor.
Wow.
So he didn't take it. Now, just by happenstance, his resignation was accepted the next day by President Buchanan, and Beauregard officially accepted his new role on March 1st, 1861, and set off for Charleston to be with Governor Francis Pickens and take command of the South Carolina troops being recruited around Charleston. He'll actually be the first Confederate to be appointed a brigadier general in the Confederate Army.
Yep, he's the first Confederate States general. And I have a really interesting quote. It's a good quote here about his appearance. And so this would have been at the time of the Civil War. He's described his skin was smooth and olive complexioned. His eyes were half lidded, were dark with a trace of melancholy about them. His hair was black. He was strikingly handsome and enjoyed the attentions of women, but probably not excessively or illicitly. He sported a dark mustache and goatee, and he rather resembled Napoleon III, then ruler of France, although he often saw himself in the mold of more celebrated Napoleon Bonaparte. And that was from a newspaper article written about him. Another interesting thing about Beauregard is by 1860, he is maintaining his black hair with dye. And that is going to become a problem when the blockade running starts during the Civil War.
Well, yeah.
Because he won't be able to get his hair dyed. What a diva.
No, it's tough. He complains, furniture, everything he wanted back. But once he gets back to New Orleans, Braxton Bragg learns of this. And he's actually pissed off because he's under the assumption of a rumor that Beauregard was being named commander of the whole army. It wasn't the case,
that would have ticked Bragg off.
But you're going to start to see later on some of these personal fissures and problems that take place between guys like Bragg and him.
Yeah.
You don't really associate Braxton Bragg with Beauregard, but they have a long history.
Yeah.
Now, Beauregard's going to arrive in Charleston and meet with Governor Pickens at the Charleston Hotel, who immediately saw the secession frenzy. This is Beauregard now. And he took over the city's, and he saw the 50,000 citizens in a lather, which was a powder keg, with the Federals on Fort Sumter. Now, Beauregard wanted a peaceful separation from Buchanan and for the fort to be withdrawn, through negotiations, which of course ultimately failed. Now, in Washington, via the U.S. State Department under Chief Robert Chew, told Governor Pickens, who Chew actually went in person to Charleston to deliver this message, which was kind of ballsy. He tells Pickens that they intended to send supplies to Fort Sumter by force if necessary. Beauregard realized at this point there's not going to be a peaceful evacuation here.
No.
He's realizing. So he begins to plan that attack on Fort Sumter using his engineering skills, and he began to line up a circle of fire surrounding Sumter from all the forts in Charleston Harbor. If you've been at Charleston Harbor, you know Castle Pinckney, Fort Moultrie. Yeah. It's a shooting gallery. Now, the first step of an impending attack was Beauregard began to cut off food and heating oil that was still being supplied to the fort from Charleston. They were still getting supplies from Charleston.
Yeah.
The perception is that they were cut off. They weren't. Yeah. Abner Doubleday. This is early April, so he probably took a day off from his baseball opening day responsibilities. He was at Fort Sumter and said by the 7th, it was wholly cut off. So they were cut off. 2 p.m. on April 11th, Beauregard had everything ready, but he also had a personal reason to try one more time to settle the matter peacefully. And that was, of course, because of why?
Robert Anderson, he had been one of his instructors at West Point. Beauregard held a lot of respect for him, and the last thing he wants to do is fire upon this guy.
Yeah, he was one of Anderson's artillery students at West Point. He was also a brother in Freemasonry, and he asked him one last time to surrender out of respect to him and their past. Now, unfortunately, Anderson refused, and just after 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Walker received a 3-word telegraph from Beauregard. It simply said, "We opened fire."
Wow.
That's all it said. Now, Beauregard saw the U.S. flag lowered on Fort Sumter. He immediately dispatched 3 aides to Anderson with an ample supply of whiskey and cigars as a Masonic courtesy. But Anderson does what?
He refuses it.
He says no thanks. Now, soon later, a white flag was raised and arrangements were made to withdraw the garrison at Sumter. The official surrender will come on April 14th at 4 p.m. But Beauregard refused to see his old teacher embarrassed, so he did not attend the ceremony. He did not want to see him. for that reason. So he did not, and actually Beauregard did not even enter the fort until Anderson was safely on board and away on the steamer Isabel. So again, you're seeing some of these personal, examples of how he saw people in the past.
Yeah. Like there's this respect for Robert Anderson, who he just does not, last thing he wants to do is fire upon this guy who he holds in high regard. And obviously they're friends as well.
And again, predictably, after this whole thing goes down, Beauregard is a national hero in the South, and he's the Confederacy's first superstar. And he received praise from everyone in the South. In the North, he was feared and respected as a true foe to the Union.
Yep.
Really, he was Robert E. Lee before there was Robert E. Lee.
Yeah,
that's how popular he was.
He's and too, the other thing that many thought he looked like a French marshal or like Napoleon in Gray is the one story I found, and that's what Beauregard wanted them to think, that he was Napoleon. But at the same time, he's also victim, and this is happening during the war as well, of all kinds of rumors because he is Creole, and there is a definite stereotype against Creole, saying that he was unfaithful to his wife because apparently that was a Creole characteristic, and also that he like had wagon trains, like kind of like Hooker of women, that like he's kind of the same type of stuff is being said about him that was said about Joseph Hooker as well. But I found that really interesting about how he was kind of viewed as this kind of like, and he's always trying to fit in.
Yeah, but he was also accepting these accolades. Yeah. Jefferson Davis wrote to him, and this is a quote from Davis, "Thank you for your achievements and courtesy to the garrison at Sumter. If occasion offers, please tender my friendly remembrances to Major Anderson." Okay. Secretary of War Leroy Walker writes, "General, you have won your spurs." Judah Benjamin, the first Confederate Attorney General who would later become Secretary of War, who's got that nice smile in his picture.
Yep.
He writes, "My dear General, Louisiana is proud of her son, and I am a Louisianan heart and soul." Now again, he got a lot of credit for this. And some in the South probably thought maybe he got a little bit too much, right? Jefferson Davis rewards him by ordering him to Pensacola, Florida, to work again with Braxton Bragg to seize Union forts held at Fort Pickens. And again, Beauregard wanted no part of it because, for one, he wasn't on great terms with Bragg anyway already. But two, he realized Fort Pickens was not going to be shooting fish in a barrel like Sumter was. It was going to be much more difficult. And he told him, basically, we have no Navy. So he ends up staying in Charleston by telling Davis that he thought it was a bad idea. And Davis apparently acquiesced to this. But it ticked Davis off, and it became the first fissure between the two that's going to grow as the war goes on.
They do, and we all know Jefferson Davis is not necessarily picking people for command that would do a good job. Army of Tennessee is a prime example of that, where he puts people in command that he's friends with, and the ones that probably should have been in command had lower positions. So this is the beginning of that pattern with Davis.
And again, Jefferson Davis, we've said many times, thought he was the smartest man in the room, and he doesn't like being told no. But the one thing that stuck in Davis's head from Beauregard was the quote, "We don't have a Navy." So which forced Davis to double down on building one, which led to reaching out to people like John Fraser in Liverpool in England. That's where this whole thing kind of gets started. But on May 28th, 1861, Beauregard is ordered to Richmond, which is the new rebel capital of 2 days prior, to meet again with Davis. Beauregard is going to arrive in town, and a huge group of supporters are cheering him as he gets off the train. Now, Davis named Beauregard to command the main portion of the rebel army in Virginia, and on May 30th, he does return to Richmond as commander to that huge welcoming party that's going to take him to the Spotswood Hotel. And it's interesting, too, because they had this big, huge carriage with these horses, big pageant, and he's like, "I'm not getting on that." He goes, he just took like a regular small little carriage because even he thought it was a little bit too big. He was a conquering hero coming to Richmond. The next day, he's going to meet with Davis as well as another officer who was his advisor and commander of the Virginia State Forces, a man named Robert Edward Lee, who had just returned from visiting a railroad junction called Manassas, about 25 miles from Alexandria. And again, these three guys, and again, Beauregard is a superstar. He is the man. they're sitting and talking about the importance of Manassas Junction and how they could absolutely not let the Federals capture it and cut off the railroad and communication lines that led to Lower Virginia. So what happens? It's decided Beauregard is going to leave the next day from Manassas Junction and take command of the junction, and on June 1st, he's going to get there. But what was his background again, Mary?
Engineering.
He's an engineer, right? He's going to spend the next 3 days examining the terrain with that engineer's eye, and immediately hates everything he sees.
Yep.
There's too many Fords, not enough DQs, not enough men.
Not enough DQs.
So he's going to write a letter complaining about it to Davis. He writes, "Dear Sir, I have arrived here on the 1st and immediately examined the site of encampment. I must be reinforced at once. I have just 6,000 effectives, and I must prepare to retire in the direction of Richmond. We are badly armed and badly equipped with hardly any means of transportation." So again, Beauregard was many things, okay? But one thing he lacked sorely was how to read a room politically.
Oh, yes. He's not good at that at all.
So you're coming off of a meeting with Lee and Davis, who they tell you, this is important. You need to do this. He goes up there, and the first day, he says, "Give me more or I'm out of here."
Yeah.
And they're like, well. But here's the thing. Instead of waiting for Davis to send those transports he desperately wanted, he goes behind his back. Oof. There's a colonel in the 7th Virginia who was a politician who had connections in the area. His name was James Kemper. Right? He tells Kemper, "Can you find me some local wagons? Can you go to the locals and find out?" He goes behind Davis's back, and Kemper gets him 200 wagons.
Wow.
So again, he's kind of biting the hand that feeds him here a little bit. He's thinking, I can't wait for this guy. I need to do what I do. He also suggested, Beauregard does, that we need to build a cartridge factory here because we have no ammo. And he quotes, "No soldier should ever go into battle with less than 40 rounds and 60 in reserve." So he's complaining about what he sees.
But you can't blame him for doing that. Like, Davis obviously doesn't have the, he's not realizing it.
They're all new at this.
Yeah, and
right?
Beauregard's the one that is seeing this is what we need to do or we're not going to win.
The other issue he had was uniforms.
Yeah.
Now, many of his men wore Union blue uniforms from the state militia. And he realized if we get in a fight, it's going to be shirts for shirts here. Yeah. We need shirts and skins or something. Got to figure something out. He's going to call on local women to deliver colored fabric that he can use to basically make handkerchiefs to wrap around their arms.
Yeah. So
you can tell. Like in kindergarten, you're playing capture the flag, somebody has the red pin. That's what he does because it was the only way he figured they could possibly know each other.
Yeah.
He had just 6 brigades. So he writes a long letter explaining the urgency of getting more men. Now, he had his eye on Joseph E. Johnston's men currently at Harper's Ferry.
Yeah.
He wanted them, right? Got to have them. He was under the impression, Beauregard was, that they were going to be attacked by at least 30,000 men. That was his deal. So he's complaining to his boss that the numbers are big. I don't have enough men.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like McClellan, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And the ties and the comparisons between McClellan and Beauregard are intertwined throughout the war.
Yeah.
They're kind of the same guy.
Yeah, they are.
Beauregard's going to write a long letter to his friend, a senator named Louis Wigfall from Texas, who he knew from Charleston apparently, complaining about his plight. Now, he's writing a letter complaining to the president. This is to a Confederate senator. He writes, "How can I be expected to maintain my ground unless I'm reinforced immediately? I have applied 2 or 3 times for the most essential things required here!" Exclamation point. It's bashing the boss.
Yep. That is not good to do with Jeff Davis. You do not bash the boss.
No. Davis still hadn't responded, so he sends another letter on July 11th saying, "Hey, I told you I'm going to have to withdraw if I don't get what I want here." Eventually, he says, well, I need to send someone personally. He sends Colonel John Preston to meet with Davis, requesting that he unite his army with Johnston's army at Manassas to contend with the Federals. Yeah. Davis basically told him merging both armies made no sense. And Lee agreed with him for whatever reason. So he rejects the request outright, including his request for additional supplies.
Well, that's because Davis believes that he doesn't think Beauregard is good with logistics or intelligence or relative military strengths, and certainly not politics, which, I mean, Beauregard was not good with the political part, but everything else. But this is going to begin this, as you said, there's the fissures between Davis and Beauregard. And one of them is because Beauregard would often come up with these grand strategies based on formal military principles, and he and Davis would argue about it throughout the entire war. They basically would just argue.
Again, Beauregard was at the top of his game.
Yeah.
And he looked at someone like Davis the way that McClellan looked at Lincoln.
Yep.
Just stay out of my way. Let me do what I'm going to do.
Yep.
And it, like you said, it drives that wedge between the two of them. But Beauregard's going to basically say, well, I'm going to have to figure this thing out.
Yeah.
The first Battle of Manassas comes on July 21st, 1861, and he ultimately did get supported by Johnson's army in the Shenandoah, who arrived just in time to help lead that rout over Beauregard's former West Point classmate, Irvin McDowell. We're not going to talk about the details, but despite the resounding Confederate win, Davis was falling out of love with Beauregard.
Yeah.
And even though he continued to see his star shining brighter daily in the South, he realized this guy is getting a little big for his britches here, Mary, is what's going on with this.
And the other thing that Davis did not like was that Johnston and Beauregard, they got along pretty well. They were friends, and Davis kind of saw Johnston as being too passive. Like, he ranks above Beauregard, but Johnston was like basically acquiescing to what Beauregard was telling him a lot. Davis didn't like that. And Davis would tell Johnston, you need to basically, you outrank him. You can't do this. But then, Johnston does something that really ticks Davis off, which is he writes Davis on July 23rd and recommends that Beauregard be promoted to full general, which Davis does approve. And that will establish Beauregard's date of rank as the date of his victory at Manassas, July the 21st, 1861.
Yep. And again, others in the Army, the Confederate Army, saw this victory as one that belonged to Johnston more than Beauregard. And that's realistically the truth.
Yeah.
Historian William C. Davis is a professor at Virginia Tech University, Hokies, right? He writes of Beauregard, by acting chiefly as a dime store general, riding along the line to cheers of his troops, accepting huzzas of the soldiers, and complimenting them in turn. So William Davis is basically saying Beauregard is more Kelsey than Gronkowski.
Yeah.
Is what he's kind of saying, right?
Yeah.
And it's getting to his head a little bit. And like you said, he does get promoted to full general on the 23rd of July. But again, the battle did bring out some flaws that Beauregard quickly wanted to fix, though. Again, the uniform issue was a huge one. The other issue was the lack of a standard battle flag.
Yes. Yep.
And this is a great story, too. The Stars and Bars flag, the one that they looked upon, looked so much like the U.S. flag, it caused more confusion on the field.
Yep.
So he's going to get together with Joseph E. Johnson and a fire-eating, fun-loving politician named William P. Miles from South Carolina. And they create a new battle flag, right? And it's the one you think of today when you think of the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
Okay. But you know the story of how this whole thing came together with the silk?
It was women visiting Beauregard's army, and they contributed silk from their dresses to create the first three flags, one for Beauregard, one for Johnston, and then one for Earl Van Dorn.
Yeah.
And these flags ended up containing more feminine pink. Right. So the flag looks pink.
The first flag is pink and blue and white. It's just, and that obviously got changed to the red silk later on. But the flags, it's just one of those things. It's kind of funny. But again, Beauregard's peak probably hit as far as popularity in the winter of 1861.
Yeah.
And this is really when he really overstepped, right?
Yes, this is when, as the army goes into their winter quarters, this is where Beauregard is going to start causing considerable friction with the Confederate high command.
He's that I would have guy, right?
Well, I would have done this.
He's sending unsolicited advice to Richmond about an offensive that he wanted to conduct in Maryland.
Yeah.
He also, and this is one that went up Davis sideways, he also decided to leak to the Southern newspapers about Davis's refusing to give him those supplies at Manassas.
Yep.
And if he did so, the war would have been over that day. If he just let me do what I wanted to do. He said that Davis did everything possible to try to screw up Manassas, and how much he interfered with his plans, and how much better it would have been if Davis just listened to him.
Again, this goes back to the relationship that McClellan has with Lincoln.
Yeah.
You see the same thing happening. And that's why, I mean, you and I were discussing, this episode, and you said he really is the Confederate version of General McClellan.
He is. I mean, can you imagine? You're Jefferson Davis pulling out the newspaper, having your coffee and your bagel, and throwing a little cream cheese on there, and you read the paper saying that if he just let me do my job, we would have won this if it wasn't for stupid Davis.
Like, and that's, again, goes back to don't bash the boss, especially don't go to the newspapers and bash the boss, because that's not going to work out in your favor. And two, I think in some ways, like Davis, obviously he wants to be out there fighting. He's probably like, well, if I was out there kind of thing. So I think there's a little bit just this animosity towards Beauregard as well.
Sure it is.
Like,
Davis reacts. He says, yeah, to the newspapers. You know who I give credit for winning Manassas? Joseph E. Johnston. That's who deserves credit. And of course, Beauregard lost it at this point.
Yeah.
He demands to be transferred back to New Orleans, which of course Davis rejects. Now, in late January 1862, and again, this friction between the two is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And the newspapers are picking up on it. Colonel Roger Pryor from the Confederate Congress, he visits Beauregard in Centerville to tell him he'd been transferred to the Mississippi Valley per Davis's orders. Now, the good news is he'd be in command, but he would be within Albert Sidney Johnson's army. Yeah. And again, the reason for the transfer wasn't a punishment. It was due to the fact that the Battle of Mill Springs, they lost their best officer in Felix Zollicoffer,
Yep.
and they needed a strong general to replace him ASAP. So he gets transferred, but he thinks he's being punished, but he gets talked to a little bit about here's why.
Yeah.
So Beauregard accepts the position, and off he goes to Bowling Green, Kentucky, to Albert Sidney Johnson's headquarters. And whether it's like the movie Step Brothers or whatever, they hit it off immediately.
They're having feety pajama sleepovers.
Feety pajama sleepovers immediately. The men hit it off. They became best friends, right? But Beauregard wants to go back to Virginia, and he hoped that his new commander in Johnston would eventually let him go. But they both agreed, listen, stay here. You're going to be an important part of the Mississippi Valley and Kentucky campaigns for the Confederacy. Oh, and by the way, I'll make you my second in command to Johnson's Army of Mississippi.
Yeah.
So this is on March 14th, 1862. Now, the issue in front of mind was the federal armies commanded by U.S. Grant, as well as Don Carlos Buell.
Yeah.
And it became a white-hot issue after the fall of Fort Henry and Donelson, right? Now, Beauregard was always sick, by the way.
Oh, yeah,
physically.
he was a very sickly
He was.
person.
He was Teak from South Park. That's who he was. He was sick most of spring of 1862. He had a constant throat ailment, which was probably strep throat. Is probably what it was. But it bothered him all the time. And this comes throughout this. But the rebel army is going to march to defend Corinth, Mississippi. And they'll arrive there in the same day, and they learn that Fort Donelson had fallen, and Kentucky and Tennessee were basically screwed.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they fall into. Now, it was a mess, and Jeff Davis tried to blame Johnson. It goes on and on.
Yeah.
But they concentrated their troops in Corinth to defend those crucial rail lines in Corinth, Mississippi.
Yeah.
And again, like Manassas, Beauregard complained about the supplies. Didn't have enough black powder, didn't have enough arms, the whole deal. But again, not reaching back to Richmond. He goes to the locals again. And he says, we need metal. So the locals supplied him with bells. All the churches in town gave up their church bells to make cannon. Women gave their brass candlesticks, etc., all to use to defend Corinth, right? By March 14th, 1862, he has 5 federal divisions just 40 miles away from Corinth. 40,000 men, right? Beauregard has 23,000 men, and there's about 20,000 more under Earl Van Dorn. But he's 350 miles away in Van Buren, Arkansas.
Yep.
So Johnson, Albert Sidney Johnson, is going to blow that conch shell together to say, listen, let's all meet at Corinth.
Yep.
Let's combine our armies to deal with this federal threat growing in a place near Pittsburgh Landing.
Yep.
Right? And again, Beauregard's sick, but he's preparing for an offensive to strike Grant's army at Pittsburgh Landing, before the arrival of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio. Because he figures if they all meet, we're, Star-Spangled screwed.
Yeah.
Okay? So we got to hit them separately. Beauregard's going to attack the Union troops on April 6, 1862, which will become the first great bloodletting of the American Civil War, which, of course, was the Battle of Shiloh. Now, again, we're not going to talk about a lot of battles of Shiloh, but to suffice it to say, Mary, the Confederates blew a real opportunity here when Beauregard calls off the dogs when he thought he had Grant beat, and it blew up in his face hard the next day.
Because Albert Sidney Johnston gets killed,
right?
Beauregard is the one in charge after that.
You know, when Beauregard handed the orders to his subordinates, he gave Braxton Bragg the order when falling back the night. You know what Braxton Bragg said when he got the orders?
Jelly bones.
He said, my God, my God. That's all he said. Okay? When Braxton Bragg is questioning you.
That's
okay,
bad.
Just saying. Beauregard's decision to stop with the plan to finish them off the next day, he'll pay for that decision for the rest of his life, and it really is what could have been for the Confederacy. Not even, I don't think anybody's going to doubt that, to be honest. Everyone from the politicians in Richmond, his own subordinates, the Rosewoods clown, everybody was livid with him with this. When they made it back to Corinth, they all knew he blew it big time. But Beauregard was still confident, right? Back in Richmond, his 15 minutes of fame was pretty much over.
Well, he had done what he does at Shiloh is one of the more controversial decisions of the Civil War.
I think it's the biggest one on the Confederate side. He was getting killed in Richmond newspapers. A Richmond newspaper ran a poem making fun of him. And here's the poem. Here's the Teuton Beauregard, who for the truth has no regard. In Satan's clutches he will cry, I've got old Satan, victor I. And the reason these stories, and here's the thing about this. If you want to have some fun, look up the Richmond papers about Beauregard. The stories in the papers ranged from Beauregard was so sad that he refused to exit his tent, to my favorite one, that they claimed he was seen sitting on a stump petting an imaginary pheasant, ignoring all those around him.
Oh my God. That's up there with the Joseph Hooker pinwheel story.
Can you imagine he's reading this? But needless to say, Davis's confidence in him was gone faster than an IPA in our fridge here, Mary, with you here on a summer day, the last one, right? But this is what's going on in Richmond. And again, justifiably so. Now, you mentioned before, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he did claim victory here. Right? The night of the 6th, he writes a letter. He spikes the ball, right? And it blows up in his face the next day. And obviously it didn't work out too well, right?
Another story I read, just thinking of your newspaper stories, was that there was people that said that Beauregard would go months and months without smiling.
I know someone like that too. But again, Beauregard is now in charge. To your point, Albert Sidney Johnston is going to get killed. But he absolutely knows he has to defend Corinth and protect that rail line. That's a big deal. It was around this time when he learned that Island Number 10 had fallen, Mary, that Henry Halleck had left his desk in St. Louis to replace Grant. He was going to come take care of it, right? And again, this may have saved Beauregard more than anything because it took Halleck the whole month of May to get his federal armies positioned around Corinth. But when he did, Beauregard knew it was time to issue Special Order GTFO, right? He did. But again, we got to talk about this, and it's not really Beauregard's fault here, though. And this is where when maybe he gets hit too hard. The reason why he knows he can't stay in Corinth and fight is because his army was dreadfully sick.
There had been an outbreak of, I think it was cholera amongst the troops.
The water was bad around Corinth, and it was completely contaminated. Beauregard's men had typhoid, they had dysentery. More men felt the disease in Corinth than did at the Battle of Shiloh. That's how sick this was. So on May 19th, Beauregard is going to prep Richmond that he's going to be evacuating Corinth, explaining the situation and preparing for the inevitable disappointment that's going to be coming from Davis and Lee and the Richmond media. Now, a week later, he's going to call his generals together and let them know we're going to be withdrawing to Tupelo, Mississippi. Going to go see Elvis, right? And they all agreed with him, considering two things. Halleck was on the doorstep, and his men were guzzling Imodium AD like there was no tomorrow.
Oh, my God.
So they were all sick. So he devised what could be described as one of the greatest hoaxes of the entire war to allow his army to escape without a shot.
And it was the Parrott guns, right, that he made it look like there was all these guns and it turned out there weren't.
Well,
guns.
he built Quaker guns
Yeah.
out of logs. He lit hundreds of vacant campfires. He left his drummers behind to play reveille to an empty camp. He was running empty train cars in and out of corn, blasting their horn to create the illusion that his men were still there. This hoax was so good that General John Pope, he reached out to Halleck and warned him that Beauregard's about to attack.
Wow.
Beauregard was 6 miles away before Halleck realized that he'd been duped and that he vacated the dance floor.
Imagine how Halleck's reaction was to that.
Oh, God, he just probably stared at that look on his face, But perhaps to deflect the impending backlash he knew he was going to get, Beauregard wrote a letter to the Mobile Register newspaper claiming victory again to offset the lie that Halleck claimed to have bagged 10,000 rebel prisoners. So he's sitting there, he's reading these stories because Halleck has to lie too.
Yeah.
So he says he caught 10,000. He caught a bunch of drummer boys. They said they captured 10,000. He said it was not true. He writes to the newspaper, quote, "The retreat was conducted with great orders and must be looked upon in every aspect as a brilliant victory." So again, you can see how him and Little Mac are from the same cloth.
Oh, yeah.
They really
they are. I wonder if they knew each other.
I don't know, maybe. Now, you know who didn't fall for it was Richmond.
Yeah.
In the newspapers.
Yeah.
And Confederate diarist Mary Chestnut, who earlier nicknamed Beauregard Cock Robin. That was the nickname she gave him.
Cock Robin?
I don't know. She wrote, quote, "Cock Robin is as dead as he ever will be now." She hated him. She didn't like Beauregard.
Wow.
Beauregard had no problem writing to a newspaper, but you know who he didn't write to?
Davis.
He didn't write to Davis about any of this.
Nope.
He did not write anything. When he was questioned about it, Beauregard wrote, this is what he finally wrote to Davis. Davis is basically like, "Hey, what's going on in Corinth? I'm reading some stuff in the newspapers." This is what Beauregard writes to Davis, quote, "Have had no time to write my report, have been too busy organizing and preparing for a battle if pursued. P.S. My retreat was brilliant and successful. XOXO." So he basically says, "Listen, whatever you heard in the newspaper is not true. I've been kind of busy. I have to wash my hair. I haven't time.
Had to dye my hair again."
So at this point, Davis had just about had it. The same way Lincoln had just about had it with McClellan after Antietam.
Yeah.
Davis is going to write he's going to tell his wife, Verena, Beauregard is one of those generals who could walk only when close to the ground and had been placed too high for his mental strength.
Oof.
Davis then sends Albert Sidney Johnston's son, Colonel W.P. Johnston, to visit Beauregard and kind of report back on what he sees. Like, what the hell's going on with this guy? While this is happening, Davis is making plans to get rid of him. And an opportunity creates itself when South Carolina's Governor Pickens complained about John C. Pemberton's incompetency commanding the coastal defenses of South Carolina. So Pickens loved him some Beauregard from back in Charleston. And he offered this. And so Davis basically says, "You know something, what I can do? How about I send you Beauregard to Charleston and I'll ship Pemberton off to Vicksburg," which is how he ends up in Vicksburg. That's how Pemberton gets to Vicksburg, is because of a personal issue with Beauregard and Davis.
Wow.
So there's history for you right there. The final nail in Beauregard's coffin came when Davis found out that he had given himself a vacation in Mobile, Alabama, to help deal with his throat sickness. He does this without telling him.
Yeah, that wasn't. I mean, Beauregard is not doing himself any favors here by, basically like just doing whatever, like not telling the boss you're going on vacation. Like, you gotta, like, that's not good. So he's not doing himself any favors with Davis.
Not at all. He ends up leaving Braxton Bragg in charge, and he says, "Listen, he left without permission. He totally went AWOL." And when Davis found out, he finally pulled the trigger and said, "Enough of this." Beauregard finds out he'd been transferred while in Mobile, as he's being wined and dined by the Mobile elite, right? And he's hearing stories that Davis was questioning his mental health, and he was to blame for the loss at Shiloh. And then Beauregard wrote, "I am annoyed to death by having everyone look at me like a wild beast. I'm the a-hole.
That
right.
But I'm the a-hole.
But I'm the a-hole. Right? That's how he sees it. He also ripped Robert E. Lee, blaming him for a lost opportunity during his successful 7 Days campaign.
He missed an opportunity?
Beauregard writes about Lee, and again, this is amazing. Lee would have accomplished more if he had not violated the rules of war by dividing his forces. I would have done it differently.
But does he describe how he would have done it?
He doesn't. But like some people on Facebook we know, instead of working, he's sitting around complaining about everybody else, right? That's kind of what he does, right? But great news, Mary, great news. August of 1862, Beauregard, he's feeling better. He messages the War Department and says, you know what? I'm feeling pretty damn good. My throat is all feeling better. I'm ready to come back to work.
Yep.
Now, just picture you blow off your job for a while.
Yep.
And then you tell your boss, who you didn't tell you were going away, that now you're coming back to work.
Yep.
So he gets the orders. He's going to be officially named the commander of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, replacing Pemberton, and again finds himself in Charleston, where again he receives what? A hero's welcome.
Yep.
They love him there, right, from what happened earlier. Davis, to the point of this, actually got pressure from the Confederate Congress to reinstate Beauregard to where he was. And then Davis writes, if the entire world were to ask me to reinstate General Beauregard to the command I have already given to General Bragg, I would refuse it.
Yeah.
I mean,
he just does not like him, like, at all.
They don't like each other. Beauregard was happy to be back in Charleston. I mean, who wouldn't?
Yeah.
But he was fuming about losing his old job in the field. Beauregard's going to write to a friend now, and he writes, this is about Davis. The barking of Mr. Davis and his pack of others does not trouble me much. I look at their futile efforts at decrying me with supreme contempt. Now, these are public letters that have been since come out, but these guys hate each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it started off with a little bit of a fissure. These dudes flat out cannot stand each other.
No, like they can't. I would not want to see the two of them in the same room together. Like, I think that's how deep the hatred ran between them.
Oh, big time. Back in Charleston, Beauregard, he's going to go back to what he did before. He's inspecting the defenses of the city,
Yep.
and again, making suggestions to the War Department on the best thing they can do, right? And he does well. The thing about him is he does very well in Charleston. He always does, right?
He's great with engineering. Like, he promotes innovative naval defenses. He's going to do early experimentation with submarines, naval mines, which were called torpedoes. And he also has a small vessel called a torpedo ram as well.
He creates a torpedo, which is basically a small boat, a torpedo on a pole,
Yeah.
used to ram and blow up vessels. He also signed on to the famous submarine concocted by H.L. Hunley
Yep.
that would ultimately sink the USS Housatonic on February 17th of 1864. So again, he's very innovative, and he's willing to give anything a chance. His defenses helped withstand naval attacks by Rear Admiral Samuel F. DuPont on April 7th of 1863, as well as the famous land assault on Battery Wagner on July 18th by Quincy Gilmore. Everybody knows that more of the 54th Mass Battle, right? Federal gunboats unloaded 948 shells on Fort Sumter on August 17, 1863. Despite 680 shells hitting the fort, the defenses held. The bottom line is Beauregard's line of defenses in Charleston, as well as his training of the men, held out despite a hellacious federal attempt to take the city in 1863. Yeah. And again, this drove the powers that be in Washington, Stanton, Halleck, Lincoln, crazy.
Yeah.
Absolutely crazy they could not take the city. Right? The Federals do eventually capture Morris Island on September 7th of 1863 after a 58-day siege. But he held out long enough for the Confederates to move their guns from Sumter to those interior forts like Castle Pinckney and Fort Moultrie, which held the Federal boats outside the harbor. So again, despite the successes Beauregard had in Charleston, he always felt that he could be used elsewhere. Yeah. So what does he do in his spare time? He writes battle plans for other theaters and sends them to the field commanders, which they must have just loved.
Could you imagine, like, especially if you're Braxton Bragg and you're in Chattanooga and you get this battle plan from Beauregard?
Well, that's what happened. He writes Braxton Bragg a battle plan to break the stalemate at Chattanooga while he's sitting around whittling in Charleston. He's sending letters to Lee, to Bragg, all these people. And he sends Bragg a 5-step plan. You do this, you're going to take care of Chattanooga. It's going to be great. Step 1, send 35,000 troops from Lee's army of the Army of Northern Virginia to Chattanooga. Okay, no problem. Bragg, then, you will cross the Tennessee River and flank Grant at Chattanooga. Step 3, stay in the defensive in Virginia. This is going back to Lee. Number 4, win and celebrate. Number 5, Bragg could then come back to Virginia and help Lee win there because he's struggling.
Yeah.
Can you imagine you're Lee or you're Bragg or Davis and you're getting these letters? And the funny thing about it is Davis actually saw this letter because what happens? The day this letter arrives in Chattanooga for Bragg,
Yep.
Davis is there to deal with Bragg.
Oh, cool. Right, because he's there because of the petition.
Right. And so they're reading this letter, which is kind of like me sending in a letter to the Boston Celtics on how you can be more successful, right? Davis read the letter and says, you know something, this plan's not bad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very simplistic what I read. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah.
But he knew that there was no way Lee was taking 35,000 troops away, and that was a non-starter.
He already had taken troops away because sending General James Longstreet there in time for the Battle of Chickamauga.
Right. The basic plan was recklessly expose yourself in Virginia,
Yeah.
win at Chattanooga, and then everyone goes back to Virginia to win.
Yeah. And everyone's happy.
Right. Everybody wins,
Yeah.
Steal underpants, profit, question mark.
What?
Exactly, right? On his way back to Richmond from Chattanooga, Davis actually stopped in Charleston on November 12th, 1863, where he received a dinner invite from their new governor, Millage Bonham, as well as some local officials, including who? P.G.T. Beauregard. So they're all going to get together, they're going to have a dinner. Beauregard gets the invitation to dine with Davis. Guess what he does?
Refuses to go.
He says, nope. He responds back, quote, Governor, I would afford much pleasure to dine with you, but candor regrets me to inform you that my relations with President Davis cannot participate in any act of politeness which might make him suppose otherwise. It goes on. Davis has killed my enthusiasm in our holy cause. May God forgive him. I fear I shall not have charity enough to pardon him.
Ouch.
So this is him.
He's an angry man.
He is. At dinner, Davis tells the entire, because he knows about this, sends the entire dinner party. What a great job Charleston was being defended by Major Stephen Elliott. He doesn't give Beauregard any credit.
Wow. So that's just like with, was it Manassas?
Everyone knew it was Beauregard, but he gave credit to Major Stephen Elliott. And Stephen Elliott did a lot, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But it was an obvious shot at Beauregard considering his conspicuous absence from the dinner.
Yeah.
Right? March of 1864, Beauregard travels to Florida when his troops there repelled an attempt by Federals in Jacksonville and wanted that situation to see it firsthand. Now, while they're on March 2nd, he's going to learn what? He's going to learn his wife Caroline has died.
Yeah.
Suddenly outside of New Orleans. Now, again, he immediately returns to Charleston for details. Now, New Orleans is under federal control, and that's where his wife is. And Beauregard wrote, my poor Caroline must have asked herself on her bed of pain if she'd ever see me again. She must have said, quote, the country comes before me. That quote, the country comes before me, he had put in her gravestone.
Wow.
So that's what happens. Yeah. Now, New Orleans, again, like I said, was under federal control at that point under the great Nathaniel Banks, Mary, from Waltham, Massachusetts, right? Banks was also a Freemason. And as a sign of respect towards his fellow Masonic brother Beauregard, he provided a steamer to carry her body upriver for burial in her native parish of St. John the Baptist. So Beauregard is going to spend the rest of his life proud of the way his wife died as a Southern woman in a federal-occupied city, and kind of pushes that narrative.
Yeah.
But again, Banks hooks him up. Hook up brother up, right? Now, whether it be his defense of Charleston or sympathy from his wife's death, in the spring of 1864, Beauregard's career has somewhat of a renaissance.
Yeah.
Probably because he was one of the few Confederate generals who saw any success in 63 at all.
Yeah.
I mean, think about how the situation is.
Yeah.
Part of his revival was thanks to General James Longstreet, who saw how bad Bragg was when he was in Tennessee that summer.
Yeah.
Longstreet comes up with a plan of his own for Beauregard to join him to help invade Kentucky and let him lead the attack. But again, Davis, seeing the name Beauregard, says, nope,
not happening.
Ain't going to happen, right? But in April of 1864, though, Davis does reassign Beauregard to Virginia and sends him to Weldon, North Carolina, where on April 20th, he's going to command the Department of North Carolina and Cape Fear, which included Virginia south of the James River. But Beauregard promptly changed the name of the army to the Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia.
Yeah.
Just wanted to change it.
Yeah.
You know? But the Rebs were in the process of preparing for the Union Spring Campaign of 1864, which is going to be known as what?
The Cold Harbor?
The Overland Campaign. Yeah. So they're preparing for this inevitable U.S. Grant assault. Lee wants Beauregard to protect the southern approaches to Richmond while guarding his supply lines at all costs. And again, Beauregard had some issues, but again, he was going through this career renaissance now where he was kind of being looked upon positively again. Beauregard, though, would also be serving directly under Braxton Bragg, which he was fine with by most accounts. And he was a model subordinate to Bragg.
Yeah.
He must have had some kind of I got to figure this thing out with these people.
Yeah, I better not run my mouth like I usually do.
But then Bragg mentions to Davis that Beauregard's been really supportive and he's been a really good subordinate. And Davis writes back angrily, I do not doubt the readiness of General Beauregard to serve under any general who outranked him. So what is Davis saying? It's like, he better freaking be acting well.
Yeah.
You're his boss. Don't tell me how great he is. He's doing his job.
Well, and I think that goes back to just how Davis felt about, the relationship that Beauregard has with Joseph E. Johnston, early on in the Civil War, and even to some extent Albert Sidney Johnson when they're at Shiloh and in that campaign, that Davis felt that Beauregard would often overstep and even go above those who outranked him.
Right.
But Joseph E. Johnston was a little bit more passive with him in that regard. And I think really, wanted to know what Beauregard thought about situations. And Davis saw it as like, you need to be show them that you outrank him or whatever.
Oh, definitely. But when Grant does finally launch his overland campaign, Beauregard's still sitting in Weldon, North Carolina, which is close. It's not like this is a shot on Beauregard. He was still where he was. 22,000 troops under Benjamin Spoon's Butler Mary. They're going to get on transports on the James River, and they're going to seize City Point, Virginia, 8 miles from Petersburg. He then landed troops at a place called Bermuda 100 between James and the Appomattox Rivers, which gave him easy access, this is Butler now, to the Richmond-Petersburg Railroad. So again, basically Old Spoons had caught the rebels with their pants down, and now both Petersburg and Richmond are in mortal danger.
Oof.
So Davis has got to bite the bullet here, and he's going to order Beauregard to send troops under Robert Hoke to help Lee. But George Pickett, he's sitting in Petersburg, and he's got one regiment. No word if he said, sir, I only have one regiment. I have no division, right?
I have no division.
But Pickett asked Beauregard for help, as he did, and he did so. And this is, he doesn't go to Davis for permission. He doesn't do any of that. He sends him Johnson Haygood's brigade. But Bragg tried to stop the move, saying Lee needs these men elsewhere. So you got Pickett saying, listen, we're going to get run over here.
Yeah.
Can you send me Johnson Haygood? Beauregard says, yes, I will. Bragg, the boss, tries to stop this, saying Lee needs these men more, is what's going to basically happen, right? But as this whole thing goes on, Bragg ultimately explained the situation to Bragg and said, listen, here's what's going on. Yeah. And Bragg agreed. They sent Haygood to Petersburg, knowing Beauregard, unfortunately, was 100% correct. They had to realize that the dude was right about this one.
Yeah.
So Beauregard, who's still sitting in Weldon, because why? He's sick again, but he's supervising the movements of both Hoke and Henry Wise's men. Now, Davis must have got wind by Bragg that of how he bailed Pickett out. He sends Beauregard a telegraph, actually thanking him, but also ordering him to get to Petersburg now. So Beauregard will arrive in Petersburg on May 10th, and he telegraphs Bragg and Davis. He planned an offensive the next day based on intel he got that Butler was withdrawing from Bermuda 100, which of course was wrong.
Yeah.
Butler was preparing to advance to Drury's Bluff, which that battle was. But Butler screwed that up, and the Rebs were able to stabilize Lee's supply line. So again, you see a little Union incompetence here. But being a strategist, Beauregard sniffed out Grant's plan to cross the James River and try to siege Petersburg, which was still lightly defended. Beauregard is going to urge Davis to reinforce Petersburg as much as he possibly can and warned him that he expected what Grant was going to do, and that the president agreed. And rebel troops from Bermuda 100 arrived to reinforce the city just long enough for Lee's army to arrive.
Yeah.
So again, Beauregard's an engineer. He's a strategist. He sniffs out that landing, and he agrees to defend it just long enough for Lee to get down there. To at this point, Beauregard helped the Confederates avoid a complete disaster in Petersburg.
Yep.
Right? Now, this, along with the success initially holding off 16,000 Federals, which is 4,000 men at the Second Battle of Petersburg, this is on June 15th to the 18th, this is probably Beauregard's best moment as a field commander right now. So again, his star is on the rise again. So it's kind of like a stock going up and down.
Yeah.
But this success is going to earn him his own command. Again, but not one of the commands he wants. So think back what's going on in 64 in the Confederacy, right? Lee wants someone to go into the valley and threaten Washington. He also wants someone to replace Johnston in Atlanta.
Yep.
So Beauregard kind of says, "I'll happy to do both."
Yep.
Lee's going to choose obviously Jubal Early, go to the valley, which ends up in the Battle of Manassas. But he's going to pick John Bell Hood to command the Army of Tennessee after Atlanta. But Beauregard was out of Davis's doghouse. That's how he saw it, right?
Yeah. But then after the fall of Atlanta, Davis does consider replacing Hood with Beauregard.
Well, that's the thing, is the job that Beauregard ultimately gets is actually Hood's boss.
Yeah.
So he's basically, but before that though, Davis does go, he's going to replace Johnston. He goes on to Lee. What do you think about putting Beauregard in this position? Lee said, this is probably a good idea, but I've got John Bell Hood knocking on my door, begging for this position. We're BFFs. I need to give this to Beauregard. I mean, to Hood over Beauregard.
Yep.
So on October 2nd of 1864, though, Davis will meet with Beauregard in Augusta, Georgia, and he's going to offer him a command of the Army of the West, which includes 5 states from Georgia to the Mississippi River. But like we said a second ago, this means that Beauregard will now command Hood's Army of Tennessee, and he, along with Davis, are going to be the architect of Hood's, what will be the Franklin-Nashville campaign.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about it, though, is, Beauregard doesn't get along with a lot of different people.
No.
But him and Hood will become very close during this time.
Yeah.
And they will stay close until Hood dies in 1879. And despite the disaster that the Franklin-Nashville campaign was for Hood, Beauregard realized that there weren't many options left to try to stop Sherman as he invaded the Carolinas.
Yep.
So again, his last resort was to try to consolidate what was left of his troops and get to the Carolinas to stop Sherman from linking up with Grant in Virginia. Just got to speed this up a little bit, right? But Davis and Lee both felt Beauregard was over his head following the Nashville disaster. So guess what Davis does? He fires him again.
Was he fired as much as McClellan was?
I think more, actually. Oh my gosh. So with little options, Davis is going to appoint Joseph E. Johnson, who he just fired before, again to command on February 22nd, again, the anniversary of today, 1865. But Beauregard is going to remain with Johnston as a subordinate for the remainder of the war. But here's the thing, though. Davis tells Johnson, Beauregard will be your subordinate, but he is to have 0 combat responsibilities.
Yep.
He is basically going to ride shotgun with you for the end of the war. Just keep this guy busy.
They just want, Davis just does not want him meddling around anymore.
I mean, to Davis's defense, he's given him chance after chance after chance. Now, it's not his fault that Franklin fell apart.
No.
Unfortunately, it's not. But again, when you hate somebody, you're going to look for reasons not to. After Lee surrenders at his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, right, it was basically ball game. Everybody knew it.
Yeah.
So on April 22nd, Beauregard and Johnson are going to meet with Jeff Davis to let them know that, listen, we need to give it the old quit here.
Yeah.
We need to surrender. This is over. April 26th, they do surrender to William Sherman, and Beauregard is going to board a transport ship and return to New Orleans. Again, he's bitter. Big states' right guy, big soldier guy. And he doesn't like the way the war ended, but he does not like the way he was treated down the stretch by Davis and by Lee.
Yep.
I mean, he felt like he got screwed, right? Yep. He really did. Again, he felt he's writing messages, battle plans, he's doing everything, that he's the smart kid.
Yeah.
right? So when the war ends, he's one of the Confederates who ultimately, at least initially, refuses to take the oath of amnesty.
Yep. And he finally does in New Orleans because Lee and Johnston counseled him to do so.
Right.
And then he is part of the mass pardon by President Andrew Johnson on July 4th, 1868. His final privileges as an American citizen are going to be restored by General Grant in 1876.
Yeah. And the thing about his post-war days is they're interesting because they kind of parallel a little bit those of James Longstreet and John Mosby a little bit.
Yep.
Basically, we fought the good fight, but again, it's time for the country to kind of mend itself back together again. But clearly, he wouldn't have advocated, that hockey game he played.
He would not.
No, he would not
have been a fan.
He would not have, right? Speaking of that real quick. But Beauregard, again, he grew up on a plantation and around the institution of slavery. But he was also very friendly with them. So after the war, he spoke publicly in favor of black civil rights.
Yep.
And he said they should basically have the right to vote.
Yep.
He kind of came around, right?
Yep. And I think it was Longstreet is in New Orleans at the same time as Beauregard is. And I think Longstreet had some influence over him as well in talking to him about this, saying like, look, this is what we need to do. This is why we need to do it.
Exactly. It makes sense. And the thing is, Beauregard's military career is over. He needs to make money.
Yep.
So he goes to use his engineering background and he invented a cable car rail system.
Mm-hmm.
And when it became too successful, his own shareholders basically staged a hostile takeover.
Yep.
And guess what happened? He got fired again. Right?
You mean he didn't go into insurance like everyone else did?
No, he didn't. But here's a cool thing about him, though. He ends up becoming the supervisor of the Louisiana State Lottery. And he becomes sort of their public spokesperson in 1877.
Yep.
And in a visual that I find hilariously fascinating, he enlists Jubal Early to join him to make public appearances together, to do lottery drawings. And they did this for 15 years.
Wow.
So imagine old Jube pulling the numbered ball out of the jar and swearing to himself as he fumbles around trying to read it.
That must have been after he came back from Canada.
But think of those TV shows now with a Powerball where they pull the numbers, but TV, but it's Early and Beauregard. Just picture the visual of that, right?
That needs to be a meme.
Oh, God, probably, But I mentioned a bit ago that Beauregard and John Bell Hood became really close during their days in Tennessee. When Hood died in 1879, he left 10 orphan children behind him. 10 orphan children, right? According to Beauregard, one of his proudest moments, this is Beauregard now, was his direct impact in making sure Hood's memoirs got published so to provide income for his orphan children. Yep. So he really stepped up on this. Despite his love for many of his former peers in the Army, there was one person he never softened on. Guess who that was?
Davis.
He hated Davis until his dying day. When Jeff Davis died in 1889, Beauregard was asked to be part of his funeral procession in Richmond. And guess what Beauregard did?
He was like, nope.
He refused it.
Wow.
It took him 3 seconds to refuse the order. He said of it, quote, "We have been enemies. I cannot pretend I am sorry that he is gone. I am no hypocrite." Wow. So talk about dancing on the grave. Beauregard took his hatred of Jefferson Davis to his grave when he died himself on February 20th of 1893 of a heart attack in New Orleans at age 74.
Yep, and he would have had today, basically hardening of the arteries. So he had heart disease, which is what ultimately killed him.
Who knows if that throat thing was part of it? He was sick seemingly his entire life. But history shows Beauregard for the most part as he was. They get him right for the most part.
Yeah.
And we talked before about he was the guy in the bullpen they never really used.
Yeah.
And it's because Davis never really trusted him.
No.
And that's unfortunately a personal issue, probably robbed the Confederates of a really strong strategist.
Yeah.
A fervent states' rights Confederate like many. He felt he was the smartest guy in the room, so it's no surprise that he'd have a conflict with someone like Davis, who also felt he was the smartest guy in the room. At the end of the day, he was a brilliant engineer and a brilliant strategist. But like so many in today's world, Beauregard's ego and attitude in his mouth were his biggest barrier to success with his bosses. And that's the same. You could talk about anybody with that.
Yeah, and we do like McClellan, but McClellan did himself no favors either by the stuff that he said. And how he conducted himself much the same way as General Beauregard does. Yeah,
and again, you can sort of see it, but it's unfortunate. When you read about these people, a good book that you read will be the ones that talk about the personalities.
Yeah.
But again, this is a situation where Beauregard, good soldier on the field, good strategist, good engineer, good general. Why did he keep falling on his junk over and over and over again? And again, when you're sitting in camp and you're having some success and you're starting to write letters to people who aren't having success and what I would do to fix your situation, human nature says you're going to get a virtual middle finger from somebody.
Yep.
And he got that a lot. He did finally loosen up a little bit towards the end, took a shine to people, specifically Hood. But again, he was someone, it's not hard to figure him out. Mm-hmm. People didn't like him because he was that guy.
Yeah.
He was that guy. He just was. Rich kid, rich background, big mouth, thought he was smart, graduated second at West Point in his class, and just felt that if he were in charge, this would be a big win. He was the Confederate George McClellan in a lot of different ways. He really, really was.
I definitely agree with that he definitely was. There's lots of parallels and some similarities between the two of them.
And again, history goes down and shows that he's famous, but again, he's somebody who I think it could have been a lot different for him.
Yep.
It could have been a lot different in the South, especially when Johnson goes down. Mm-hmm. If he was somebody who could have picked up the ball and been strong after the death of Albert Sidney Johnson, who knows how that changes history?
Or who knows if Davis had gone through with putting him in command after Atlanta falls and replacing Hood with him. Like, who knows? That's another what if as well with Beauregard.
There's a lot of this stuff. But again, these people are trying to figure this out in real time.
Yep.
But Davis hated Beauregard. Beauregard hated Davis. Despite all the things that Beauregard did, every single time that he was allowed out of the doghouse, he put himself right back into it again.
Yep.
And so, F-A-F-O, Mary.
Yep.
That's what it was. That's what it was.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
So I think we can drop old Beauregard here. It's a lot of fun.
It's a great discussion.
Yeah, it definitely is. And he's somebody who I think people know because he's a famous name. He's by no means a B-lister. He's an A-lister. But when you really get into him and get to his story, he reminds me of so many people everybody knows. Everyone works with P.G.T. Beauregard.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I mean, everyone, I'm sorry, that's the truth.
Yep.
Everyone knows him because that's his personality.
Yep.
So it is what it is. So what's coming up for us next, Mary?
So next, we are going to be scheduling another roundtable again soon. And we're going to be sitting down here at the old Civil War breakfast headquarters in Gettysburg and talking about what our next episodes are going to be as well.
A lot of fun stuff coming. Thank you to everybody who came out, by the way, to Getty's Gear on Sunday.
Thank you.
We had a great event. Carrie and Jenna took care of us, and we had some trivia. We had some fun with that. So I think it's March 22nd, I believe. We're going to be doing a presentation over there as well. There's going to be a handful of people giving presentations. We'll be doing one on the Battle of Bentonville.
Yep.
There'll be a lot of our friends doing presentations as well. So if you're in the area, if you're not in the area, jump in your car and drive to the area.
Yeah, on March 22nd.
To Getty's Gear on Baltimore Street in Gettysburg for a fantastic day of history, fun, and shenanigans held by all. Maybe even the Rosewoods Clown might even show up.
Could you imagine?
We'll find out. We'll find out. Anyway, so off we go. Any final words from you, Fincheru?
Thank you for bringing it like you always do. And also thank you to all of our listeners for your support. Love it when you guys pop on our YouTube live streams that we do as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. So, Mary, I don't want to hear any more cockiness about this hockey game. It's over. Okay. So stop running your mouth about the hockey game. It's over. Okay. But in any case, off we go. So I guess we're done.
One final story I want to tell. How we decided to do this episode. We were sitting at the old Blue and Gray on wing night, and we were talking about which episodes we needed to do. And of course, we were having some beer. And Beauregard's nickname on this.
I would never.
Beauregard's nickname on this podcast has always been Beauregard.
Right.
So we decided to do this episode while we were having a drink at the Blue and Gray. And I think I just said, I'm like, let's finally do an episode about Beauregard.
Well, like an aspect of life, Mary, many great things come from meetings over alcohol. And that's the case. So off we go. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate it. Live tomorrow on YouTube. Hopefully you can join us. A lot of fun stuff going. The weather is warming, Mary, allegedly. So battle season is coming. So a lot of chance to go see some battlefields. So off we go. Everybody, appreciate it. We'll see you all on the other side.
See y'all later.
Peace out.
Bye.